he told his mistress. "I was stupid until I walked in with proof of his crimes." Lucy Wellington stood in the marble foyer of her Connecticut estate, her manicured fingers trembling as they gripped a manila folder that contained everything: bank statements, phone records, photographs, and the kind of evidence that would shatter lives and send people to prison. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 p.m., its deep, resonant tones marking the exact time she'd scheduled to meet Charlie and his lawyer. But today she wouldn't be the quiet, compliant wife they expected. Her reflection in the ornate hallway mirror showed a woman transformed. Same perfectly coiffed auburn hair, same designer navy suit, same strand of pearls her grandmother had worn. But her green eyes held a clarity and steel that had been absent for decades. The woman looking back at her was someone Charlie Wellington had never met, and someone he would never be able to manipulate again. Just 3 months ago, everything had been different. 3 months ago, Lucy had been grateful. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March when her world cracked open. She'd returned early from a charity luncheon that had been canceled due to the guest speaker's sudden illness. Instead of calling ahead, she'd slipped through the garden entrance, not wanting to disturb what Charlie had described as an important conference call about expanding his consulting business. She was heading toward the kitchen when his voice carried clearly from the study, the mahogany door sitting slightly ajar. But it wasn't the professional tone she expected to hear. This voice was relaxed, intimate, almost jovial. "Trust me, Amber, after 25 years, I know exactly how to handle her." Lucy froze in the hallway, her heart beginning a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Amber. She didn't know any Amber. But what if she finds out about the Cayman accounts? The voice that responded was distinctly female, younger than Lucy's 52 years, and filled with worry that made Lucy's stomach clench. Charlie's laughter, rich and carefree, made her blood turn to ice. "Sweetheart, my wife couldn't find her way through a balance sheet if her life depended on it. She's dumb but rich, which makes everything perfect for us. I've spent decades convincing her she's financially helpless." The words hit Lucy like physical blows. She pressed her back against the cool wall, her legs threatening to buckle as her husband continued with casual cruelty. "You should see her at board meetings, Amber." Nodding along like she understands what's happening, then thanking me afterward for translating everything into simple terms. "The woman has an Ivy League education, but I've got her convinced she can't handle anything more complex than a grocery list." Amber's laughter joined his, light and conspiratorial. "How do you manage it? Doesn't she ever get suspicious?" "It's all about consistency," Charlie explained, his voice taking on the satisfied tone of a man discussing a successful business strategy. "Whenever she shows interest in finances, I overwhelm her with jargon, then simplify it in a way that makes her feel stupid for not understanding the first time. After a while, she stops asking questions altogether. Now she actually apologizes for bothering me with boring money stuff." Lucy slid down the wall until she was sitting on the marble floor, her designer suit crumpling around her. 25 years of marriage, and she'd been nothing more than a convenient source of funding and social respectability. Every gentle correction, every patient explanation, every moment she'd felt grateful for his protection, all of it had been calculated manipulation. "What about the foundation money you've been moving?" Amber's voice held a note of anxiety that Lucy barely registered through her shock. "She signs whatever I put in front of her." Complete trust. Hell, she's been funding our entire lifestyle without even realizing it. Her inheritance, the foundation accounts, even her mother's jewelry collection. She has no idea what any of it's actually worth. The conversation continued, but Lucy could barely process the words through the roaring in her ears. When she finally heard them making arrangements to meet later that evening, she forced herself to stand and quietly retreat to the kitchen, where Maria, their longtime housekeeper, took one look at her pale face and immediately poured her tea. "Mrs. Wellington, are you feeling all right?" Maria's concerned voice seemed to come from very far away. Lucy stared at her reflection in the kitchen window, seeing a stranger. The woman looking back appeared perfectly composed, pearl earrings still in place, lipstick unsmudged, posture as elegant as always. But inside, everything she'd believed about her life was crumbling into dust. She wasn't the beloved, cherished wife Charlie had always claimed she was. She was his mark, his victim, his fool. Before we continue deeper into Lucy's journey of discovery and awakening, I want you to know something important. You belong here in our Weathered Rose Stories family. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button because these stories of women finding their strength, their voice, and their true worth are shared especially for you. Every story we tell here honors the resilience that lives within us all, the quiet power that others sometimes try to convince us we don't possess. Ring that notification bell too, because you won't want to miss what happens when a woman finally sees the truth clearly and decides to reclaim every ounce of her power. That evening, Charlie arrived home with his usual cheerful demeanor and a bouquet of white roses, her favorites, or so she'd always believed. Now she wondered if even that preference had been assigned to her rather than discovered. "How was your day, beautiful?" He kissed her cheek with apparent affection, his hazel eyes crinkling with the smile that had once made her feel like the luckiest woman alive. "Did the luncheon go well?" Lucy watched him carefully, searching his handsome face for any sign of guilt or deception. At 54, Charlie remained as charming as the day they'd met at a university fundraiser. His silver-streaked hair and confident bearing still turned heads at social gatherings. He seemed genuinely pleased to see her, genuinely interested in her day. It was educational, she managed to say, the word carrying far more weight than he could possibly understand. Over dinner, Charlie asked about her plans for the upcoming charity gala, discussed their summer vacation to the Hamptons, and even complimented her new hairstyle. He was attentive, charming, exactly the devoted husband she'd always believed him to be. The disconnect between this loving man and the cruel stranger she'd overheard was almost impossible to reconcile. That night, Lucy lay awake staring at the ceiling while Charlie slept peacefully beside her, his breathing deep and untroubled. Every conversation they'd ever had about money now took on a sinister cast. Every moment she'd felt grateful for his financial expertise became a fresh source of humiliation. Just last week, she'd thanked him for handling the complicated insurance paperwork. She'd felt blessed to have a husband who shouldered all the boring financial burdens so she could focus on the things that mattered to her. But now she understood that the things that mattered to her, her charitable work, her social connections, her family relationships, had all been carefully curated to keep her occupied while Charlie plundered her resources. The emotional devastation was complete. Lucy realized she no longer knew who she really was. For so long, she'd defined herself as Charlie's wife, accepting his version of her limitations as absolute truth. If she wasn't the helpless, financially naive woman he'd convinced her she was, then who was she? The early struggles began immediately. The next morning, Lucy tried to act normal, but every interaction with Charlie felt like participating in an elaborate theater production where only she knew the script was a lie. When Charlie asked her to sign some routine paperwork, foundation business, he explained with his usual patient smile, Lucy found herself actually reading the documents instead of simply trusting his summary. The legal language that had always seemed impenetrable suddenly appeared less mysterious, and she realized the papers authorized significant fund transfers she didn't remember discussing. "Since when are you interested in the fine print?" Charlie asked, his laugh sounding slightly forced to Lucy's newly attuned ears. "I thought I should try to be more informed," she said carefully, testing the words. His smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Lucy, sweetheart, you don't need to worry about these details. That's what I'm here for." But Lucy was beginning to worry about everything. She questioned her friends' perceptions of her marriage, her daughter's occasional frustrations with her passivity, and most painfully, her own buried instincts that she'd learned to ignore over the years. The woman who had once challenged economics professors and written insightful analyses about art market trends had been systematically convinced she was intellectually inadequate. The rage building inside her was matched only by profound grief for all the parts of herself she'd allowed to be diminished and discarded. 3 days after her devastating discovery, Lucy took her first tentative step toward reclaiming her agency. She called Rebecca Mitchell, the family's financial advisor, and requested a private meeting. "I'd like to review my personal accounts," Lucy told Rebecca over the phone, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. There was a brief pause on the other end. "Of course, Mrs. Wellington. Should I coordinate with Charlie to include him in the meeting?" "No," Lucy said, and the firmness in her own voice startled her. "Just me this time." Rebecca Mitchell's office occupied the 32nd floor of a glass tower in downtown Hartford, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering sweeping views of the Connecticut River Valley. The mahogany conference table and leather-bound legal volumes were designed to inspire confidence in the firm's expertise. But as Lucy sat across from Rebecca's desk, she felt like an imposter preparing to expose her own ignorance. What if Charlie was right? What if she really was too naive and simple-minded to understand her own financial situation? Rebecca, an elegant woman in her mid-40s with graying hair and kind but sharp brown eyes, spread several documents across the conference table with the precision of someone accustomed to handling complex financial portfolios. "I have to say, Lucy, may I call you Lucy? I've been hoping for this conversation for years." The comment caught Lucy completely off guard. You have? Absolutely. Your insights during our foundation board meetings have always impressed me. Your questions about portfolio allocation and risk assessment show remarkably sophisticated understanding. I've often wondered why you never took a more active role in managing your personal wealth. Lucy stared at Rebecca, feeling as though she were hearing these words in a foreign language. My sophisticated understanding? Without question. Remember last year when you suggested diversifying the foundation's holdings to include emerging Asian markets? That recommendation increased our returns by 12% over the following quarters. Charlie implemented the strategy beautifully, but the original analysis was clearly yours. The revelation hit Lucy like ice water. She had made that suggestion, had spent hours researching market trends, geopolitical factors, and risk assessments. When Charlie had praised her lucky guess and taken over the implementation, she'd felt grateful for his expertise and slightly embarrassed by her amateur dabbling. Now she realized he had stolen her work and convinced her it was worthless intuition. Rebecca continued reviewing Lucy's accounts, and with each revelation, Lucy's shock deepened into something approaching awe and fury. The foundation accounts she'd assumed held modest amounts actually contained millions of dollars. The small inheritance from her grandmother that Charlie had described as around $200,000 was actually worth nearly $2 million. The investment portfolio she believed Charlie managed with his superior knowledge contained assets and growth patterns she'd never been told about. "I don't understand," Lucy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Charlie told me my total inheritance from my grandmother was modest, maybe $200,000. Rebecca's eyebrows drew together in concern. "Lucy, your total personal assets exceed $15 million. You're an extraordinarily wealthy woman in your own right, independent of Charlie's business income. Your family trust, your inheritance, the foundation accounts you control, plus several investment portfolios that have been performing exceptionally well for years." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Lucy gripped the edge of the conference table, her knuckles turning white. $15 million? At minimum. And Lucy, You've been making excellent financial decisions for years. I have detailed records of your recommendations, your strategic suggestions, and their outcomes. Your instincts about market timing and risk management have been consistently sound. Lucy felt physically sick. While she'd been feeling grateful for Charlie's financial protection, she'd actually been funding their entire lifestyle with her own money. The vacations to Europe, the luxury cars, the renovations to their estate, all paid for with her assets while Charlie convinced her she was financially dependent on his generosity. Has Charlie been managing these accounts? Lucy asked, her voice barely steady. Rebecca's expression grew troubled. He has power of attorney for some transactions, which you signed several years ago. But Lucy, some of the recent transfers have been unusual. Large amounts moved to accounts I don't recognize. Investments in offshore funds that don't align with your typical risk profile. Lucy felt the last of her naive trust crumble into dust. What kind of transfers? Over the past 18 months, approximately $1.2 million has been moved from your foundation accounts to what appear to be shell companies in the Cayman Islands. The paperwork shows your authorization, but Rebecca hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. But what? But the investment strategy doesn't make sense for someone with your financial goals. These moves seem designed to hide assets rather than grow them. Lucy's hands were shaking now, but not from nervousness, from rage, pure, clean, clarifying rage. The resistance began the moment. Lucy walked through her front door that evening. Charlie was waiting in the living room, his expression carefully controlled, but his posture tense. "Rebecca called," he said casually, but Lucy noticed the way his jaw tightened. "She mentioned you had some questions about our accounts." "My accounts," Lucy corrected quietly, and watched Charlie's eyes flash with something that might have been alarm. "Right, of course. Our accounts. Anyway, she said you seemed confused about some of the recent transactions. I told her not to worry. You've been under a lot of stress lately with the gala planning." Lucy studied her husband's face, noting how smoothly he shifted blame to her supposed stress, how naturally he positioned himself as the reasonable party explaining her confusion to concerned professionals. "I wasn't confused," she said. "I was learning." "Learning?" Charlie moved closer, his hand reaching for her shoulder in what once would have felt like a comforting gesture. Now it felt controlling, possessive. "Honey, you know how these financial documents can be overwhelming. Remember what happened when you tried to help with the tax preparation last year? You got so flustered you had to lie down for the rest of the day." Lucy remembered that incident differently now. She'd been asking legitimate questions about deductions that seemed questionable, expenses that didn't align with their actual spending. Charlie had responded by overwhelming her with tax code language, legal jargon, and increasingly complex explanations until she'd felt stupid and inadequate. She'd retreated to her bedroom, not from complexity, but from his deliberate obfuscation. Maybe I was overwhelmed because the explanations weren't actually explanations, she said quietly. The comment hung in the air between them like a challenge. Charlie studied her face with new attention, and Lucy saw the exact moment he realized something fundamental had shifted in their dynamic. "Is everything okay, Lucy? You seem different lately, suspicious. It's not like you." The direct question terrified her because she wasn't ready for open confrontation. She needed more information, more evidence, more time to understand the full scope of what Charlie had been doing. But she also needed to protect herself from his growing awareness that she was no longer the compliant woman he'd molded. "I'm fine," she lied, "just trying to take more interest in our financial situation." That evening, Charlie was unusually attentive. He brought her wine, suggested they start planning their summer trip to Martha's Vineyard, and reminisced fondly about their early years together when they were building their life from nothing. But Lucy noticed how skillfully he steered every conversation away from anything substantive, how he interrupted whenever she began to express an independent thought or question. When she mentioned wanting to attend the next Foundation Finance Committee meeting, something she'd never shown interest in before, Charlie laughed with what seemed like genuine amusement. "Those meetings are deadly boring, honey. Nothing but budget projections and compliance regulations and risk assessments. Why don't you focus on the fundraising gala instead? That's where your real talents shine. You have such a gift for bringing people together." The dismissal was gentle but absolute, wrapped in praise that felt increasingly hollow. Lucy realized how many times over the years Charlie had redirected her energy toward appropriate activities while claiming all the substantive decisions for himself. Her social skills were celebrated, but her analytical mind was dismissed. Her intuition about people was valued, but her insights about investments were treated as lucky guesses. Later that night, alone in the study that had been her sanctuary for years, Lucy began what would become her most important project: documentation. She opened a leather journal and began recording every conversation, every dismissal, every instance of Charlie's subtle manipulation that she could remember. The woman he'd convinced lacked analytical ability began building a case against him with methodical precision. She also reached out to Jennifer Monroe, her closest friend from their Yale days, carefully testing the waters of what felt like dangerous territory. "Jen, this might sound strange, but do you remember how I used to be in college? Intellectually, I mean." Jennifer's surprise was evident even over the phone. "Lucy, you were brilliant. You could analyze market trends better than our economics professors. You wrote that paper on art as alternative investment that half our class used as a reference for years afterward. Why are you asking?" "Just wondering if I've changed. Honey, you haven't lost that intelligence. It's still there, still sharp as ever. Maybe it's just time to start using it again." The conversation left Lucy both hopeful and heartbroken. The analytical mind Charlie had convinced her she'd never possessed was still there, dormant but intact. The woman who had once challenged graduate professors and written complex financial analyses hadn't disappeared. She'd simply been buried under decades of systematic conditioning. Over the following days, Lucy began her careful resurrection. She started reading financial publications again, something she hadn't done since her early marriage, when Charlie had convinced her such materials were too dry and complex for her tastes. She discovered that the concepts weren't beyond her understanding at all. In fact, many of the strategies being discussed were approaches she'd instinctively suggested over the years, only to have Charlie dismiss them as impractical or naive. The resistance to Lucy's awakening came from multiple directions. Charlie's increased vigilance made her feel like she was being monitored in her own home. Her own decades of conditioned self-doubt whispered that perhaps she was overreacting, misunderstanding, creating problems where none existed, and most terrifyingly, the prospect of rebuilding her identity at 52 years old felt almost insurmountable. But for the first time in years, Lucy felt a spark of her former self igniting. The woman who had once fearlessly questioned authority figures and challenged conventional wisdom was stirring back to life, and she was angry about all the time that had been stolen from her. Chapter 2. Over the following weeks, Lucy began what felt like the most important investigation of her life. She scheduled regular appointments with Rebecca Mitchell under the guise of learning more about charitable foundation management. But really, she was absorbing everything she could about her own financial empire. Because that's what it was, she was beginning to understand. An empire that Charlie had been systematically plundering while convincing her she was too simple-minded to notice. What she discovered during these sessions was both empowering and infuriating. Charlie hadn't just been living off her money while taking credit for their financial success. He'd been actively stealing from her. The foundation money intended to provide scholarships for underprivileged women had been partially diverted to high-risk investment ventures that seemed designed to benefit Charlie's business associates rather than generate returns for the charity. These transfer authorizations require your signature, Rebecca explained during one of their Tuesday morning meetings, sliding documents across the polished conference table. But Lucy, these moved $1.2 million to a Cayman Islands investment fund. That's not routine compliance paperwork. Lucy studied the papers, recognizing her own handwriting with a sick feeling in her stomach. I remember signing these. Charlie told me they were routine tax forms, something about updating our charitable giving status with the IRS. Lucy, Rebecca said gently, these authorize the movement of foundation money to offshore accounts that have no clear connection to your charitable mission. This isn't tax compliance. This is asset relocation. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. Lucy had been unknowingly funding not just Charlie's comfortable lifestyle, but his systematic theft of money intended to help women gain the education and independence he'd spent decades denying her. But with each devastating revelation, something powerful was awakening within Lucy. The analytical mind Charlie had convinced her she didn't possess began working with laser focus. She started maintaining detailed spreadsheets, cross-referencing bank statements, tracking investment patterns, and building a comprehensive picture of their true financial situation that revealed the depth of Charlie's deception. During this period of investigation, Lucy also began reconnecting with her own intellectual capabilities in ways that felt like rediscovering lost pieces of her soul. She enrolled in online courses in investment management and forensic accounting, telling Charlie she was taking art history classes to keep her mind occupied. She began reading financial newspapers and business magazines, hiding them inside fashion publications when Charlie was around. Most remarkably, she discovered that understanding complex financial concepts wasn't difficult for her at all. The woman who had once analyzed European art markets and written academic papers about economic trends and Renaissance patronage found that corporate finance and investment strategy felt familiar, almost intuitive. Her transformation didn't go unnoticed. Emma called after one of their monthly lunch dates, her voice filled with excitement that warmed Lucy's heart in ways she hadn't expected. "Mom, I don't know what's changed, but you seem so much more yourself lately, more like the woman I remember from when I was little, before you started deferring to Dad about everything." "What do you mean?" Lucy asked, though she knew exactly what Emma meant. "Yesterday, when I was telling you about the marketing budget for my latest campaign, you caught a calculation error that I'd missed completely. You used financial terms I didn't even know you knew. And when we were discussing my apartment lease renewal, your advice about negotiating terms was more sophisticated than anything my lawyer suggested." Lucy felt a surge of pride that was both familiar and foreign. "I've been reading more about financial topics lately." "It's more than that, Mom. You seem sharper, more present, like you're finally using that incredible brain I always knew you had, but that somehow got, I don't know, hidden away." The validation from Emma meant everything to Lucy. Her own daughter had noticed her intellectual reemergence, confirming that the changes were real, visible, and represented a return to authenticity rather than a departure from it. Meanwhile, Charlie's behavior became increasingly controlling as he sensed Lucy's growing independence, though he seemed unable to identify exactly what was changing. He started forgetting to include her in social plans, making unilateral decisions about their calendar, and becoming more dismissive of her opinions in ways that felt almost frantic. During a dinner party at their home, one of the elegant gatherings Lucy had orchestrated for years, she witnessed Charlie's manipulation tactics from her new perspective and felt sick at how clearly she could now see the patterns. When the conversation turned to investment strategies, Charlie automatically attempted to steer it away from Lucy with his usual smooth deflection. "Lucy doesn't bother herself with the tedious money talk," he told their guests with what appeared to be affectionate humor. "She keeps us focused on what really matters: family, community, the things that make life meaningful." But this time, instead of feeling grateful for his protection from boring topics, Lucy felt diminished and silenced. When their guest, Thomas Wright, Charlie's business partner, mentioned emerging market trends in Asian technology sectors, Lucy surprised everyone, including herself, by offering a detailed analysis. "The infrastructure investments are interesting," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heartbeat. "But the regulatory environment in those markets carries significant political risks that aren't reflected in current valuations. The potential returns are attractive, but the volatility could be devastating for anyone who doesn't understand the cultural and governmental factors involved." The dinner table fell completely silent. Thomas Wright stared at Lucy with obvious surprise and growing respect, while Charlie's face tightened with what looked like barely concealed annoyance. "That's actually a very sophisticated observation, Lucy," Thomas said slowly. "Have you been following those sectors closely?" "I've been doing some research," Lucy replied calmly, meeting Charlie's eyes across the table and seeing something that might have been fear. Later, after their guests departed, Charlie confronted her in the privacy of their bedroom, his charm completely absent for perhaps the first time in their marriage. "What was that performance tonight?" His tone was sharper than she'd ever heard it, the mask of patient husband slipping to reveal something harder underneath. "I was participating in the conversation. You embarrassed yourself, Lucy." Thomas was just being polite. "You were talking about things you don't understand." But Lucy remembered Thomas Wright's expression. It hadn't been politeness. It had been genuine surprise, followed by respect. For the first time in decades, she trusted her own perception over Charlie's interpretation of reality. The build-up continued as Lucy carefully tested her growing knowledge and confidence in small but significant ways. She began asking pointed questions during charity board meetings, catching discrepancies in reports that others had missed, and offering strategic suggestions that were immediately adopted. Her fellow board members, who had politely ignored her for years, began actively seeking her input on complex decisions. During one particularly significant board meeting, the treasurer presented a budget that didn't align with their fundraising goals. While others nodded along with the presentation, Lucy raised her hand. "I'm concerned about the allocation for administrative expenses," she said, her voice carrying new authority. 30% seems excessive for an organization our size. Most similar foundations operate with administrative costs closer to 15%. Where is the additional money actually going?" The room buzzed with surprised murmurs as board members began examining their copies more carefully. The treasurer looked flustered, shuffling through papers as he tried to explain the discrepancies Lucy had identified. "Mrs. Wellington raises an excellent point," said the board president. "Perhaps we should table the budget approval until we can get more detailed breakdowns of these administrative costs." As the meeting ended, several board members approached Lucy to compliment her analysis and ask for her insights on other financial matters. For the first time in years, she felt intellectually valued and respected. She also continued developing her support network, though she was careful to move slowly and avoid arousing Charlie's suspicions. Rebecca Mitchell became more than just a financial advisor. She became a mentor in Lucy's journey back to financial literacy and self-confidence. "You know, Lucy," Rebecca said during one of their sessions, "in my 15 years as a financial advisor, I've rarely encountered someone with your intuitive understanding of risk assessment and portfolio balance. You seem to have an almost instinctive grasp of market psychology." But Charlie always said, "I didn't have the temperament for financial complexity." "Charlie was wrong," Rebecca interrupted firmly. "Either he was mistaken about your abilities, or he deliberately convinced you that you lacked skills you clearly possess. I can't speak to his motivations, but I can tell you that your analytical capabilities are exceptional." The distinction was crucial for Lucy. Was Charlie's undermining of her confidence a result of his own limitations, or had it been deliberate psychological manipulation? The overheard phone conversation provided her answer. It had been systematic, calculated, and devastatingly effective. As her investigation deepened and her confidence grew, Lucy faced her first real test of her newfound assertiveness. Charlie presented her with a stack of papers during breakfast on a Saturday morning, his manner casual but his eyes watchful. "Just some year-end foundation business, honey," he said, sliding the documents across the table alongside her coffee and fresh croissants. "Rebecca's already reviewed everything, and she asked me to get your signature before the quarterly filing deadline." Lucy accepted the papers but didn't immediately reach for her pen as she would have done just months earlier. Instead, she began reading through the documents with the careful attention she'd been developing during her secret education. "These authorize the transfer of $800,000, she observed quietly, looking up to meet Charlie's eyes. His smile became slightly strained. "Right, it's just a portfolio rebalancing. Nothing to worry about. We're moving some funds to higher yield investments. To an account I don't recognize. Wellington Holdings, LLC. I've never heard of that company." "Lucy, sweetheart, this is exactly why I handle these details. You're getting confused by the technicalities. Wellington Holdings is just a subsidiary we use for certain investments. It's completely normal." But Lucy wasn't confused anymore. She was seeing clearly for the first time in decades, and what she saw was a man who had built his entire relationship on her supposed inadequacy. "I'd like to review these documents with Rebecca before signing," she said, her voice calm but unmovable. Charlie's mask slipped entirely. "Rebecca works for us, Lucy. I don't need her second-guessing routine financial management decisions." "She works for me," Lucy corrected quietly, "and these are my funds being transferred." The confrontation that followed marked Lucy's first true empowerment peak, the moment she absolutely refused to be dismissed, undermined, or manipulated. Despite Charlie's increasing anger, his attempts to make her feel guilty for questioning his judgment, and his implications that her suspicions were signs of mental instability, Lucy held firm. "I'm not signing these papers today," she said with finality. "I want to understand exactly where this money is going and why." Charlie's face cycled through several expressions: surprise, calculation, anger, then a forced return to patronizing concern. "Lucy, you're making this more complicated than it needs to be. These transfers are necessary for our financial security. Then you won't mind explaining them to Rebecca in detail." That night, Lucy lay awake realizing that her marriage might not be salvageable, but her sense of self finally was. The dumb but rich woman Charlie had mocked to his mistress was disappearing, replaced by someone who was beginning to understand her own worth, her own capabilities, and her own power. "I'm already seeing comments from so many of you sharing your own experiences with being underestimated or having your intelligence questioned by people who should have been supporting you. Your stories matter deeply, and they're exactly why we're building this community together. If Lucy's awakening resonates with you, don't just drop a heart emoji. Share in the comments below how you faced moments when someone tried to convince you that you were less capable than you knew yourself to be. Your voice and your experience could be exactly what another woman needs to hear today." The major turning point in Lucy's journey came exactly 6 weeks after her financial awakening, during what should have been a routine charity board meeting. As treasurer of the Women's Education Foundation, a position she'd held for 8 years but had never fully embraced due to Charlie's constant reminders about her financial limitations, Lucy was reviewing the monthly financial reports when something caught her trained eye. The numbers were wrong. Seriously, impossibly wrong. For years, she had signed off on financial reports that Charlie had pre-reviewed for her, accepting his assurance that everything was in order and that the complex details weren't worth troubling her about. But now, with her newly sharpened analytical skills, Lucy noticed discrepancies that made her stomach clench with dread and recognition. The Women's Education Foundation, funded primarily by Lucy's substantial personal donations and her family, Trust should have contained $3.2 million in assets based on their fundraising records and her documented contributions over the years. The current report showed only $1.8 million. Lucy excused herself from the board meeting, claiming she needed to make urgent phone calls, but instead she drove directly to Rebecca Mitchell's office with the foundation reports clutched in her trembling hands. "I need to see every transaction involving the Women's Education Foundation accounts for the past 3 years," Lucy told Rebecca without preamble, her voice steady despite the panic building in her chest. Rebecca's expression grew increasingly grave as she pulled up the comprehensive records on her computer. Together, they traced a pattern of systematic theft that left Lucy breathless with rage, betrayal, and a growing sense of her own power. Over 3 years, Charlie had been methodically siphoning money from the foundation through an elaborate network of consulting fees and administrative costs that all traced back to shell companies he controlled. The pattern was sophisticated, carefully designed to avoid triggering automatic audits, but devastating in its cumulative impact. "Lucy," Rebecca said softly, her voice heavy with concern, "this isn't just marital betrayal we're looking at. This is embezzlement from a charitable organization. This is federal fraud." The total theft was staggering. $1.4 million that had been intended to provide scholarships for underprivileged women, money that could have changed dozens of lives, had instead been diverted to fund Charlie's comfortable lifestyle and whatever investments he was making through his hidden accounts. But the worst discovery was still ahead. Among the diverted funds, Lucy found regular monthly payments to A. Stevens Consulting, $5,000 per month for the past 2 years. Charlie had been paying his mistress Amber Stevens with money stolen from a foundation dedicated to helping women achieve independence through education. Lucy sat in Rebecca's office, staring at the evidence of her husband's crimes spread across the conference table, and felt something fundamental shift within her consciousness. The grief and self-doubt that had characterized her journey so far crystallized into cold, laser-focused determination. "What are my legal options?" she asked Rebecca, her voice carrying a steel that surprised them both. "Extensive," Rebecca replied. "Criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud, civil recovery of all stolen funds, asset freezing to prevent further theft, and of course, dissolution of the marriage, with full asset protection for you. But Lucy, once you take these steps, there's no going back. Your life, as you know it, will end completely." Lucy thought about the woman she had been 6 weeks earlier, grateful for Charlie's protection, apologetic for her limitations, believing herself fortunate to have a husband who managed all the complex financial responsibilities so she didn't have to worry. Then she thought about the 25 women currently receiving foundation scholarships and the hundreds more who could have benefited from the money Charlie had stolen. "The woman I was 6 weeks ago is already gone," Lucy said quietly. "I want to explore every legal option available." That evening, Lucy returned home to find Charlie in his study, speaking on the phone with someone he quickly dismissed when she appeared in the doorway. His guilty expression and flustered manner told her everything she needed to know about who he'd been talking to. "How was your day, beautiful?" he asked, but his smile seemed forced, and Lucy noticed a tension around his eyes that hadn't been there that morning. "Educational," Lucy replied, using the same word she'd chosen months earlier, but now it carried the weight of devastating knowledge. Over dinner, Lucy observed Charlie with the detached clarity of someone watching a skilled performer. Every charming smile, every affectionate gesture, every concerned inquiry about her stress levels felt calculated and false. She realized that living with him had become like sharing her home with a talented con artist who happened to be her husband. The most devastating realization came later that night as Lucy reviewed documents in her private study. She discovered that Charlie had been planning this systematic theft for years, gradually establishing offshore accounts and shell companies while simultaneously working to undermine her confidence in her own financial capabilities. The manipulation of her self-worth hadn't been casual emotional abuse. It had been a carefully orchestrated strategy to prevent her from discovering his crimes. She also found evidence that Charlie had been corresponding with divorce attorneys for months, exploring ways to minimize his financial obligations should their marriage end. While he'd been convincing her that she was financially dependent on him, he'd been planning to leave her with as little as possible when his theft was complete. The cruelest detail was contained in Charlie's personal notes, which she found in a locked drawer of his desk, a lock she'd learned to pick using YouTube tutorials during her weeks of investigation. His handwritten observations indicated that he believed Lucy was too naive and trusting to ever discover his deception, and too emotionally dependent on him to function independently, even if she did somehow stumble across evidence of his crimes. Lucy closed the files and stared at her reflection in the dark window of her study. The woman looking back was no longer the grateful, sheltered wife Charlie had married. She had become someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous to his plans than he could possibly imagine. She thought about Emma, about the example she'd been setting for her daughter by accepting diminishment and manipulation as expressions of love. She thought about the scholarship recipients who had been denied opportunities because of Charlie's greed. She thought about the woman she used to be, sharp, questioning, unafraid of intellectual challenges, and the woman she was becoming again. Most importantly, she thought about the future. Charlie's version had her remaining ignorant and grateful, while he continued stealing from her and the women her foundation was meant to help. That future was no longer acceptable, not just for her, but for every woman who deserved better than what Charlie's worldview offered. Lucy opened her laptop and began drafting an email to the FBI's white-collar crime division. Then she deleted it and called Rebecca instead. "I want to meet with that criminal defense attorney you mentioned," Lucy said. "And Rebecca?" "I want to do this correctly. Every piece of evidence documented properly, every legal option explored thoroughly, every step taken with absolute precision. If Charlie believes I'm too naive to discover his crimes, he's about to learn exactly how wrong he's been about my capabilities." The major turn was complete. Lucy was no longer trying to save her marriage or seeking justice merely for personal betrayal. She had become a woman with a mission: to stop Charlie's crimes, recover every stolen dollar, and ensure that no other woman would fall victim to his particular brand of manipulation and theft. 2 months after discovering the full scope of Charlie's embezzlement, Lucy faced her darkest moment. Despite her growing confidence and steely determination, the weight of dismantling a 25-year marriage and potentially sending her husband to federal prison threatened to overwhelm her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The crisis began when Emma called, her voice shaking with distress and confusion that broke Lucy's heart. "Mom, Dad told me about your investigation into the family finances," Emma said carefully. "He's really worried about you. He thinks you might be having some kind of breakdown." Lucy sat in her study, surrounded by meticulously organized evidence of Charlie's crimes, and realized how skillfully he had been manipulating the narrative around her behavior. To Emma, this looked like her mother having a midlife psychological crisis, rather than uncovering systematic fraud. "Emma, there are things about your father that you don't understand." "Mom, listen to yourself," Emma interrupted, her voice filled with the kind of patient concern that Lucy recognized from her own years of accepting Charlie's gaslighting. "You're talking about Dad like he's some kind of criminal mastermind. This is the man who built our family's financial security, who's taken care of you for 25 years, who's devoted his entire adult life to making sure you never had to worry about anything." The conversation was devastating because Lucy heard her own former voice in Emma's words. The absolute faith in Charlie's integrity, the inability to imagine that someone so charming and caring could be capable of calculated deception and theft. "Your father has been stealing money from the Women's Education Foundation," Lucy said quietly. "Money intended to provide scholarships for women who can't afford college education. Mom, you're scaring me. Dad said you've become obsessed with conspiracy theories about money that doesn't even make sense to you. He's been trying to protect you from the stress of financial management, and now you're accusing him of being a thief?" The isolation deepened when Lucy discovered that Charlie had been systematically undermining her credibility with their entire social circle. At Jennifer Monroe's birthday celebration, a small gathering of women Lucy had known for decades, she overheard a conversation that made her realize how comprehensively Charlie had destroyed her reputation. "I feel so sorry for Charlie," one woman was saying. "He's handling Lucy's breakdown with such grace and dignity." "What kind of breakdown?" another asked. "Apparently she's become convinced that he's been stealing from her charities. She's making wild accusations about offshore accounts and embezzlement. Charlie thinks it might be early-onset dementia, but he's too loyal to say that publicly." How terrible for him. He's been such a devoted husband, managing all their finances so she never had to worry about the complexities. And now she's repaying his protection with paranoid delusions. Lucy stood frozen behind a potted plant, listening to her friends, women she'd known for years, discussing her supposed mental deterioration with pity and concern for Charlie. She realized that his charm and manipulative skills extended far beyond their marriage. He had preemptively discredited her with everyone who might have offered support, painting her potential accusations as symptoms of psychological instability rather than evidence of his crimes. The gaslighting campaign was masterfully executed. Even some foundation board members, when Lucy attempted to raise concerns about financial irregularities, responded with patronizing suggestions that she was overwhelmed by the complexities and should let Charlie continue handling the administrative details as he always had. "Lucy, dear," said Mrs. Harrison, the foundation's longest-serving board member, "perhaps you're taking on too much responsibility. Charlie has always managed these details so efficiently. Why don't you focus on what you do best, organizing our fundraising events and building donor relationships?" The effect was overwhelming. Despite having concrete, documented evidence of Charlie's crimes, Lucy began to question her own perceptions and sanity. What if she really was having a breakdown? What if her interpretation of the evidence was somehow flawed or distorted? What if 25 years of marriage had made her paranoid and unable to distinguish between normal financial management and criminal behavior? The self-doubt reached its peak when Lucy found herself alone in her study at 2. In the morning, staring at bank statements and recorded conversations, wondering if she had lost her mind. Charlie's version of reality, that she was a beloved but fragile wife having a psychological crisis, seemed more plausible than the alternative. That her charming, devoted husband was a criminal who had spent decades systematically manipulating and stealing from her. The lowest point came when Lucy discovered that Charlie had scheduled an appointment with Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychiatrist, describing his wife as having become delusionally suspicious and making irrational accusations about their financial arrangements. "Your husband is very concerned about your mental health, Doctor," Chen explained during their session, her voice professionally gentle but clearly influenced by Charlie's narrative. "He mentioned that you've been experiencing significant anxiety and making accusations about financial improprieties that don't seem to align with documented reality. He's worried that the stress of managing charitable responsibilities may have become overwhelming for you." Lucy sat in the psychiatrist's office, realizing that even seeking professional help had been co-opted by Charlie's manipulation. She was trapped in a situation where her evidence of his crimes was being interpreted as proof of her mental instability. The breaking point arrived when Rebecca Mitchell called with devastating news that threatened to destroy everything Lucy had been working toward. "Lucy, I need to tell you something urgent." Rebecca's voice was tense with concern. Charlie has filed legal paperwork to have your power of attorney privileges revoked. He's citing your deteriorating mental condition and your inability to make sound financial decisions." Lucy felt the world tilt around her. What does that mean? If this petition is granted, you'll lose legal control of your own assets. Charlie will have complete authority over your accounts, your investments, even your foundation. He has character witnesses prepared to testify about your alleged instability, and he's documented what he claims are incidents of irrational behavior. Lucy realized that while she had been carefully building a case against Charlie's criminal activities, he had been building an equally careful case against her sanity. His strategy was brilliant in its ruthlessness. Discredit her competence so thoroughly that any evidence she presented would be dismissed as the confused ravings of a mentally unstable woman. Sitting in her garden that evening, surrounded by the roses she had planted and tended for decades, Lucy faced the terrifying possibility that she might lose everything: her credibility, her assets, her relationship with Emma, and potentially her freedom if Charlie succeeded in having her declared mentally incompetent. The despair was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Lucy questioned whether fighting back was worth the devastating cost. Perhaps Charlie was right. Perhaps she should accept his version of reality, agree to psychiatric treatment, take whatever medications, doctor. Chen prescribed and returned to being the grateful, protected wife who didn't ask difficult questions or challenge anyone's authority. But in this moment of absolute darkness, something Rebecca had told her weeks earlier echoed in her mind. You have an intuitive understanding of market psychology. Not Charlie's assessment of her abilities, but an objective professional opinion based on observed performance and documented results. She thought about the scholarship recipients whose futures had been stolen to fund Charlie's affair with Amber Stevens. She thought about Emma and whether she wanted her daughter to grow up believing that intelligent women who question authority and demand accountability are mentally ill. Most importantly, she thought about the woman she had been becoming over these months of investigation and self-discovery. Sharp, confident, unafraid to trust her own perceptions and analytical abilities. That woman existed because the evidence was real, the crimes were documented, and the intelligence Charlie had convinced her she lacked had always been there, waiting to be reclaimed. Lucy stood up from her garden bench, her resolve crystallizing into something unbreakable. Charlie's psychological warfare had nearly succeeded, but not quite. She wasn't crazy, she wasn't incompetent, and she wasn't going to let him destroy her credibility or steal her life's work without the fight of his life. The dark night of her soul ended with Lucy making a crucial decision. Instead of continuing to defend herself against Charlie's attacks on her sanity, she was going to launch a comprehensive offensive using every piece of evidence she had gathered. If he wanted to play psychological games, she would demonstrate exactly how sharp and strategic her supposedly deteriorating mind really was. The final confrontation that Lucy had been building toward arrived sooner than expected, triggered by Charlie's overconfidence and what would prove to be his fatal miscalculation. 3 days after his attempt to have her declared mentally incompetent, Charlie made a critical error. He asked Lucy to sign papers that would complete his theft of the foundation's remaining assets. Just some end-of-year portfolio adjustments, he explained over breakfast, sliding the documents across their dining room table with his practiced, confident smile. Rebecca's already reviewed everything, and she asked me to get your signature before the quarterly filing deadline. Lucy accepted the papers, but made no move toward her pen. Instead, she began reading through the documents with the careful, trained attention she had developed during months of secret education in financial analysis and forensic accounting. "These don't look like portfolio adjustments, Charlie," she said quietly, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. Charlie's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the mask of patient concern sliding into place with practiced ease. Lucy, sweetheart, we've discussed this. The financial stress has been affecting your ability to process these documents clearly. Dr. Chen thinks the complexity might be contributing to your anxiety. Dr. Chen suggested I might have anxiety, Lucy corrected. She didn't say I can't read financial documents or understand what they authorize. The room grew tense as Charlie realized that his usual deflection tactics weren't working. For the first time in months, he was facing the version of Lucy who refused to be dismissed, redirected, or made to feel inadequate. "I'm not signing these papers," Lucy stated with absolute finality. Charlie's facade began to crack. "Lucy, I don't think you understand the consequences of what you're doing. These transfers are essential for our financial security. If you don't authorize them, you could jeopardize everything we've built together over 25 years. Everything we've built? Lucy's voice remained calm, but there was unmistakable steel underneath. You mean everything I've funded while you convinced me I was too intellectually limited to understand where my own money was going? The accusation hung between them like a live electrical wire. Charlie's face cycled through several expressions: surprise, rapid calculation, then a return to patronizing concern that no longer masked his growing desperation. "Lucy, this is exactly what Dr. Chen warned me to watch for. You're having paranoid thoughts about our financial arrangements. These delusions about theft and manipulation are supported by 3 months of bank statements, transfer records, forensic accounting analysis, and comprehensive documentation that I've been compiling with Rebecca's assistance," Lucy finished, her voice carrying an authority that Charlie had never heard before. Charlie went completely still, his coffee cup suspended halfway to his lips. "What documentation?" Lucy met his eyes with steady, unflinching directness. "I know about the Cayman Islands accounts. I know about the monthly payments to a Stevens Consulting. I know about the $1.4 million you've stolen from the Women's Education Foundation over the past 3 years." The silence that followed was deafening. Lucy watched her husband's face transform as the charming, concerned spouse disappeared entirely, replaced by someone calculating and desperately dangerous. "You've been spying on me," Charlie said, his voice flat and cold in a way she had never heard. "I've been educating myself about my own finances," Lucy replied. "Something you spent 25 years convincing me I was too unintelligent to do successfully." Charlie stood abruptly and began pacing to the window, his movements sharp and agitated. When he turned back to face her, his expression was harder than she had ever seen it. "Lucy, you don't understand the complexity of what you're interfering with. Those fund transfers were made for legitimate business purposes. The foundation money is being invested in opportunities that will generate significantly higher returns for the scholarship program." "Higher returns for whom?" Lucy interrupted. "For the scholarship recipients or for you and your mistress?" The direct mention of Amber Stevens made Charlie flinch visibly. "I don't know what you think you overheard." "I heard you describe me as dumb but rich. I heard you laugh about manipulating me for 25 years. I heard you and Amber Stevens planning to use money stolen from women's education scholarships to fund your affair and your new life together." Charlie's control finally snapped completely. "You were eavesdropping on private conversations. That's invasion of privacy. It's how I learned that my husband of 25 years is a thief, a liar, and a man who finds my supposed stupidity amusing enough to mock with his mistress," Lucy said, standing to face him directly across their breakfast table. The confrontation escalated rapidly as Charlie cycled through every manipulation tactic he had perfected over their marriage. He tried anger, telling her she was destroying their family with paranoid investigations. He attempted bargaining, promising to end his relationship with Amber if Lucy would just sign the transfer papers and stop asking questions. He resorted to threats, warning her that he would have her declared mentally incompetent and that Emma would never forgive her for destroying their marriage with financial conspiracy theories. "Emma will never believe you over me," he said, playing what he clearly thought was his strongest card. "Neither will anyone else in our social circle. I've been carefully building your reputation as an unstable woman for months. Who do you think people will believe? The successful businessman concerned about his wife's deteriorating mental health, or the middle-aged woman making wild accusations she can't possibly understand?" The cruelty in Charlie's voice was breathtaking, but Lucy had been preparing for this moment for months. Instead of breaking down or backing away, she felt a strange calm settle over her like armor. "You're absolutely right," she said quietly. "No one would believe the woman you've been portraying to them. Fortunately, that's not who I am anymore." Lucy walked calmly to her study and returned with a thick leather portfolio. "These are copies of bank statements, transfer records, correspondence between you and your business associates about moving foundation funds, and detailed forensic accounting that traces every dollar you've stolen. I also have audio recordings of you discussing your theft with Amber Stevens. Our home phone system maintains backup recordings for security purposes, something you apparently forgot when you were planning your crimes." Charlie's face went white as he realized the scope of Lucy's preparation and the depth of his miscalculation. "You can't use recorded conversations without consent. Actually, I can use recordings made in my own home as evidence of criminal activity. I've consulted with attorneys who specialize in white-collar crime prosecution." The power dynamic had shifted completely and irrevocably. Charlie, accustomed to controlling every situation through charm and psychological manipulation, found himself facing a woman who had gathered irrefutable evidence of his crimes and prepared for every legal challenge he might mount. "Lucy, we can work this out," he said, desperation finally creeping into his voice. "The marriage, the money, your concerns about the foundation, we can fix all of this. You don't need to destroy everything we've built together." Lucy looked at the man she had been married to for 25 years and felt nothing but pity mixed with iron determination. "Charlie, you destroyed everything we built the moment you decided I was too stupid to notice your crimes. You just underestimated how long it would take me to prove you wrong about my intelligence." The crisis reached its peak when Charlie realized that Lucy was no longer the helpless victim he had spent decades creating and controlling. She had become the intelligent, strategic woman he had always known she could be, and she was now his absolute worst nightmare. Chapter 3. The empowerment climax that Lucy had been building toward for months finally arrived in the mahogany-paneled conference room of Morrison, Wright & Associates, where she had arranged a meeting that would change everything. She arrived precisely at 3 p.m., carrying her leather portfolio and wearing the navy blue suit she had chosen specifically for its projection of authority rather than apology. Her posture was straight, her voice would be steady, and her eyes held a clarity that had been absent from her life for decades. Charlie entered the conference room with Amber Stevens at his side, his confidence obvious and almost breathtaking in its arrogance. He had brought his mistress to what he clearly believed would be divorce negotiations he could control, using Amber's presence as both intimidation and proof that Lucy had already lost the most important battle. Thomas Wright, Charlie's business partner, looked visibly uncomfortable with Amber's presence at what was supposed to be a family legal consultation. The family attorney, David Morrison, appeared professionally neutral but alert, clearly sensing undercurrents in the room that went beyond typical marital dissolution. "I think we can settle this situation quickly and amicably," Charlie began, settling into his chair with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to controlling every room he entered. "Lucy's been under tremendous stress lately, and I believe we can reach an arrangement that protects everyone's interests while getting her the help she clearly needs." Thomas Wright shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Charlie continued with smooth confidence. My wife has been making some very concerning accusations about our family finances. I think it's best if we address her concerns directly so we can all move forward in a way that's healthy for everyone involved. Lucy opened her portfolio with deliberate precision and placed the first document on the polished conference table. It was a complete forensic accounting analysis of Charlie's systematic theft, prepared by Rebecca Mitchell and verified by 2 independent financial auditors. These documents demonstrate the systematic embezzlement of $1.4 million from the Women's Education Foundation over a 3-year period, Lucy began, her voice professionally controlled and carrying the authority of absolute certainty. The money was diverted through fraudulent consulting fees and fabricated administrative costs to shell companies controlled by Charles Wellington. Charlie's confident expression faltered as Thomas Wright leaned forward to examine the documents more closely, his face growing pale as he absorbed the implications of what Lucy was presenting. "Lucy, these allegations are completely," Charlie started, "supported by comprehensive bank records, transfer documentation, email correspondence, and audio recordings," Lucy continued smoothly, placing a second stack of papers on the table with methodical precision, including recorded conversations of Charlie discussing his theft with Miss Stevens, who has been receiving $5,000 per month in stolen foundation money through her consulting company. Amber shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her face flushing as she realized that everyone in the room now knew exactly how her relationship with Charlie had been financed. The confidence she had walked in with evaporated as Lucy continued her presentation with the systematic thoroughness of a prosecutor building an airtight case. Each piece of evidence was presented clearly and without emotional drama, building an irrefutable documentation of embezzlement, fraud, and systematic financial abuse that left no room for doubt or alternative interpretation. "This can't be accurate," Thomas Wright said, studying the forensic analysis with growing horror. "Charlie, these numbers suggest that you've been using your wife's charitable foundation to fund his affair and line his own pockets while convincing everyone, including me, that I was too intellectually limited to understand basic financial management," Lucy stated with calm finality. The room fell into stunned silence as the full scope of Charlie's crimes became undeniably clear. Lucy continued her presentation, methodically demonstrating how Charlie had manipulated her understanding of their finances, while systematically stealing money intended to provide educational opportunities for underprivileged women. "The most damaging evidence," Lucy said, reaching for a small digital recording device, "is this conversation between Charlie and Miss Stevens, recorded in my home, where he explicitly discusses stealing foundation money while referring to his wife as dumb but rich." Lucy activated the device and Charlie's voice filled the conference room, dripping with contempt and casual cruelty, as he described manipulating his naive wife and stealing from her charity. Amber's uncomfortable laughter punctuated his devastating assessment of Lucy's supposed intellectual limitations, making it clear that both of them had found her perceived stupidity entertaining. When the recording ended, the silence in the room was absolute. Thomas Wright stared at Charlie with undisguised horror and disgust, while Amber seemed to be trying to disappear into her chair. David Morrison was rapidly taking notes, clearly recognizing the legal implications of what he had just witnessed. "Charlie," Thomas said quietly, his voice heavy with shock and disappointment, "this is federal fraud. This is embezzlement from a charitable organization. If this evidence is accurate, this could destroy our entire firm." Charlie finally understood that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. The wife he had manipulated and controlled for decades had become a formidable opponent, and the evidence she had gathered was absolutely devastating to any defense he might attempt to mount. "Lucy, we can work this out privately," Charlie said, desperation finally breaking through his practiced charm. There's no need to involve federal authorities. I can return the money. We can restructure the foundation accounts. You can't return educational opportunities that were stolen from scholarship recipients, Lucy replied with unwavering firmness. You can't undo the damage done to young women who could have transformed their lives with the money you stole to pay for your affair. Lucy placed her final document on the conference table, a formal criminal complaint she had prepared for the FBI's white-collar crime division. I'm filing federal charges for embezzlement, wire fraud, and racketeering. I'm also filing for divorce and seeking complete asset recovery plus punitive damages. Charlie's face went ashen as he realized the full scope of what Lucy was prepared to do. Lucy, you're making a catastrophic mistake. You need me. You've always needed me to handle the complex financial decisions. I needed the man I thought I had married, Lucy interrupted with quiet dignity. I don't need the criminal I actually married. Thomas Wright spoke up, his voice heavy with regret and professional concern. Lucy, I want you to know that I had absolutely no knowledge of any of this. If I had known that Charlie was stealing from your foundation, if I had understood how he was manipulating your perception of your own capabilities, you would have stopped it immediately, Lucy finished for him, which is exactly why Charlie made sure that no one, including me, understood how intelligent I actually am. He convinced everyone in our social and professional circle that I was too naive and intellectually limited to understand complex financial matters. Amber finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Charlie told me you didn't understand money management. He said you were sweet and kind, but not very bright when it came to business matters. Charlie told you exactly what he needed you to believe in order to justify stealing money intended to help women achieve the kind of independence he spent 25 years denying me, Lucy replied, with perfect composure. Just like he told me exactly what I needed to hear to keep me from asking the kind of questions that would have exposed his crimes years ago. The climax reached its absolute peak when Lucy stood up, symbolically and literally claiming her power in a way that left no doubt about her transformation. For 25 years, I allowed you to convince me that I was fortunate to have a husband who handled all the complicated financial responsibilities. I let you take credit for my insights, dismiss my intelligence, and steal my money while making me grateful for the privilege. That ends today, permanently and completely. She looked directly at Charlie, and her next words carried the full weight of her complete transformation from victim to victor. The dumb but rich wife you mocked to your mistress no longer exists, Charlie. You are now dealing with someone who understands exactly how intelligent she's always been, exactly how much damage you have done, and exactly what legal consequences you are going to face. Lucy gathered her documents with precise, controlled movements that demonstrated her complete command of the situation. The FBI will receive these files tomorrow morning. Divorce papers will be served to you next week. And Charlie, every woman currently receiving scholarships from the foundation will know exactly why their funding was delayed and reduced, because their educational money was stolen to finance your affair. As Lucy moved toward the conference room door, Thomas Wright spoke up with obvious respect and regret. Lucy, for what it's worth, I always believed you were far more perceptive and intelligent than Charlie gave you credit for. I should have said something years ago. Lucy turned back with a smile that contained both triumph and sadness. Thank you, Thomas. I'm finally beginning to agree with you. The empowerment climax concluded with Lucy walking away from not just a failed marriage, but from an entire identity that had been built on accepting other people's limitations of her capabilities. She had become a woman who trusted her own intelligence, valued her own judgment, and absolutely refused to be diminished by anyone's false narrative about her worth. Charlie and Amber remained in the conference room, facing the complete destruction of their plans and the inevitable legal consequences of systematically underestimating a woman they had convinced themselves was too naive to fight back. Lucy's methodical, strategic approach had left them with no defenses and no escape from the crimes they had committed. As we approach the end of Lucy's incredible journey, I want to hear from you, and I mean really hear from you, not just hearts and thumbs up emojis. Have you ever discovered that you were stronger, smarter, or more capable than someone had convinced you to believe about yourself? Have you ever watched someone consistently underestimate you, only to have the satisfaction of proving them completely wrong? Share your own stories of empowerment and awakening in the comments below. Your journey toward reclaiming your power matters just as much as Lucy's, and this community exists to celebrate the strength and wisdom that live within each of us. 6 months after the confrontation that changed everything, Lucy Wellington stood in the sunlit conference room of the Women's Education Foundation's new headquarters, watching with deep satisfaction as Emma presented scholarships to 12 remarkable young women, scholarships funded entirely by the money that had been recovered from Charlie's systematic theft. Lucy's transformation was complete, but it wasn't dramatic in the way that might be expected. She still wore the same elegant clothing, still maintained the same gracious manner in social situations, still carried herself with the refined dignity that had always characterized her public presence. But everything underneath had fundamentally changed in ways that were both subtle and revolutionary. Her posture now reflected genuine confidence rather than performed composure. Her voice carried natural authority instead of careful deference. Most importantly, her eyes held the clarity of someone who had reclaimed not just her financial independence, but her intellectual self-respect. Emma approached after the scholarship ceremony, wrapping her mother in a warm embrace that felt different from their interactions over the past several years. There was respect in her daughter's manner now, along with what might have been a touch of awe. "Mom, I owe you the most sincere apology," Emma said, her voice emotional in a way that touched Lucy's heart. "I cannot believe I thought Dad was right about your mental state. I can't believe I questioned your judgment when you were uncovering the truth about his crimes." "You believed what you had always observed," Lucy replied gently, understanding her daughter's confusion better than Emma could possibly know. "I had taught you to see me as helpless by accepting that role for so long. How could you have known I was capable of strategic thinking when I had spent decades hiding that capability from myself?" The aftermath of Lucy's revelations had been difficult, but ultimately vindicating in ways she hadn't dared to hope for. Charlie had pled guilty to federal embezzlement charges and received a sentence of 2 years in federal prison, plus full restitution of all stolen funds. The divorce settlement, expertly handled by Rebecca Mitchell, working with the best legal team money could buy, had left Lucy with complete control of her assets and a crystal-clear understanding of her true financial position. Most importantly for Lucy's sense of justice, the public revelation of Charlie's crimes had completely vindicated her intelligence and her accusations. The community that had whispered about her supposed breakdown now spoke with admiration about her courage, her analytical skills, and her dedication to protecting the Foundation's mission. The board of directors had formally recognized her contributions to the organization's financial management, contributions that Charlie had been claiming as his own expertise for years. Thomas Wright had been instrumental in the recovery process, helping Lucy restructure her investment portfolio and providing crucial character testimony that had completely countered Charlie's attempts to paint her as mentally unstable. His professional respect for her abilities had grown into a genuine friendship based on intellectual equality rather than protective condescension. "I keep thinking about something, Doctor." Chen said during our final session. Lucy confided to Jennifer Monroe during one of their regular lunch dates. She told me that the most remarkable aspect of my case wasn't that I discovered Charlie's deception and crimes, but that I maintained my psychological stability and analytical clarity despite years of systematic emotional manipulation designed to undermine my self-confidence. Jennifer nodded thoughtfully, her expression mixing admiration with lingering anger about what Charlie had done to her oldest friend. You never actually lost that intelligence, Lucy. You never lost your capacity for strategic thinking or complex analysis. You just temporarily forgot that you had permission to use those abilities. The reflection deepened as Lucy considered everything she had learned about herself, about relationships, and about the ways that intelligent women could be convinced to diminish their own capabilities. The woman who had once apologized for asking questions now served on 3 corporate boards and had been invited to speak at conferences about financial literacy and empowerment for women over 50. But the most profound change was internal and ongoing. Lucy had learned to trust her own perceptions, to value her analytical abilities, and to absolutely refuse any relationship or situation that required her to pretend to be less intelligent than she actually was. The strangest realization, Lucy shared with Rebecca during one of their monthly financial planning sessions, is understanding that I was never actually dependent on Charlie for anything meaningful. He was completely dependent on me. My money, my social connections, my willingness to make him appear successful while hiding my own contributions. Rebecca smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had watched a client reclaim not just her financial independence, but her sense of personal worth. Strong women often don't recognize the full extent of their own strength until circumstances force them to use it. You've always had these capabilities, Lucy. You just needed a reason to stop hiding them. The story reached its emotional conclusion with Lucy in her private study, the same room where she had once sat in shocked devastation after overhearing Charlie's cruel assessment of her intelligence. Now the space was filled with financial documents she managed with complete confidence, business proposals she evaluated independently, and correspondence from young women thanking her for the scholarships that were transforming their lives. Lucy picked up a letter that had arrived that morning from Maria Santos, a 19-year-old scholarship recipient who was studying business administration at a prestigious university. "Dear Mrs. Wellington," the letter read, "Your foundation made my college education financially possible, but learning about your personal courage in fighting for these scholarships inspires me even more than the money. You showed me that intelligent women don't have to hide their abilities or apologize for their success to make other people comfortable. Thank you for proving that it's never too late to reclaim your power." The letter perfectly captured everything Lucy had hoped her transformation would accomplish. By refusing to accept Charlie's limitations and fighting for her foundation's mission, she had created ripple effects that extended far beyond her own personal empowerment. Emma entered the study carrying a tea service and wearing the kind of confident smile that reminded Lucy powerfully of her own younger self. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said about teaching me to see you as helpless by accepting that role for so long. I want you to know that I see you completely differently now." "How do you see me now?" Lucy asked, genuinely curious about her daughter's perspective. "I see you as someone who is always strong enough to handle difficult truths, always smart enough to solve complex problems, and always brave enough to fight for what's right," Emma said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "I just didn't understand that you needed permission from yourself and from the rest of us to show those qualities openly." Lucy felt tears prick her eyes as she realized that her daughter's perception meant more to her than social vindication or financial recovery ever could. Emma now saw her mother as a complete person, intelligent, strategic, and unafraid to use her considerable abilities when the situation demanded it. As the golden afternoon light streamed through the tall windows of her study, Lucy reflected on both the price and the profound value of her transformation. She had lost a 25-year marriage, but she had gained authentic self-knowledge that felt more valuable than any relationship built on deception. She had endured months of public scrutiny and social isolation, but she had discovered genuine respect from people whose opinions actually mattered. Most importantly, she had faced her deepest fears about her own intellectual capabilities and proven to herself that she was far stronger, smarter, and more resilient than she had ever dared to believe. The woman Charlie had mocked as dumb but rich had evolved into someone who understood that true wealth had nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with self-respect, authentic relationships, and the courage to trust your own judgment even when others try to convince you that you're wrong. Lucy Wellington was no longer grateful for protection she had never needed from a man who had never deserved her trust. Instead, she had become someone who protected others. Through her foundation work, her mentorship of younger women, and her living example that intelligence and strength didn't have to be hidden or diminished to preserve someone else's fragile ego. She thought about all the women who might be sitting in their own homes right now, accepting someone else's assessment of their limitations, grateful for protection from complexities they were perfectly capable of understanding. She thought about the subtle ways that intelligent women were still being convinced that their insights were lucky guesses, that their analytical abilities were overwhelming them, that they should be thankful for someone else's willingness to handle the complicated decisions. Most of all, she thought about the future, not Charlie's version where she remained ignorant and grateful, but her own version where she continued to grow, to learn, to challenge herself intellectually, and to use her considerable resources and influence to create opportunities for other women to discover their own hidden strengths. Lucy opened her laptop and began drafting her keynote speech for the upcoming conference on women's financial empowerment. The title she had chosen was simple but powerful: The Intelligence You Never Lost, Reclaiming Your Financial Voice After 50. She smiled as she began to type, knowing that her story would resonate with women who had been convinced to hide their capabilities, women who had been made to feel grateful for intellectual diminishment, women who needed permission to trust their own minds again. The story concluded with Lucy preparing for the next morning's foundation board meeting, reviewing investment proposals with the confidence of someone who had earned the right to trust her own judgment. She would evaluate the financial projections, ask pointed questions about risk assessment, and offer strategic recommendations that would be not only heard but actively sought out by her colleagues. The quiet, grateful wife was gone forever, replaced by a woman who knew her worth and had absolutely no intention of ever apologizing for her intelligence again. She had become living proof that it was never too late to reclaim your power, never too late to trust your own mind, and never too late to refuse to be smaller than you actually are. Lucy's journey from self-doubt to complete self-empowerment reminds us that the intelligence, strength, and analytical abilities we sometimes think we've lost were never actually gone. They were just waiting for us to give ourselves permission to use them again. If her story has resonated with you, if you've seen pieces of your own experience in her struggle and transformation, please share this video with other women who need to hear this message. Subscribe to Weathered Rose Stories for more tales of courage, resilience, and the incredible power that lives within each of us, sometimes hidden, but never truly lost. And remember, you are far more capable, far more intelligent, and far more deserving of respect than anyone who tries to convince you otherwise could ever imagine. Until next time, trust your instincts. Value your insights, and never let anyone make you grateful for being treated as less than you are. As the sun set over the Connecticut countryside, Lucy Wellington stood at her window, looking out over gardens she had designed, at a home she had inherited and maintained, surrounded by the evidence of a life she had built through her own intelligence, her own resources, and her own quiet strength. The woman reflecting back at her in the glass was someone Charlie Wellington had never truly known. and someone, she was just beginning to fully appreciate herself. She was no longer dumb. She had always been rich in ways that transcended money, and she was finally, completely, unapologetically free.